Thanks for tuning in tonight. Today we're going to begin a new look at a new series looking at themes and interesting yet practical passages from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. Now, when we talk about the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, we're talking about a book that is a part of what is known as wisdom literature. And this genre served a didactic purpose or a teaching purpose for Israel. And as the opening strophe of the book clearly indicates in verses 1 through 6, this is a collection of material designed to instruct people in a successful life. But the idea and the concept of a successful life is different in Hebrew, from the Hebrew concept of wisdom than, say, perhaps how the world views successful life today. Notice what it says in Proverbs 1, verses 1 through 6. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. In short, it's designed to teach, to convey what a skilled or a successful life looks like. And it conveys its content through the use of proverbs, which can be defined as profound, pithy, or short sayings that compress a complex thought into an easily understandable kernel of truth. It's a truism, sort of like that passage later in Proverbs where it talks about raise up a child in the way he should go and he shall not depart from it. But that's generally true. There are good, godly people who have raised children who have left the faith. But generally speaking, this is the best path and truth. So it's a truism, and we're seeing instruction through truisms here. Make no mistake, though, Proverbs is not a self-help book. It's not even a book reflecting mere common sense, for God is at the heart of biblical wisdom. And this theocentric aspect of Proverbs permeates the entire book. Proverbs 1, verse 7, the key passage that sets out the book. We see all the instruction, and then it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So, a reverential consideration of God underlies the entirety of the book of Proverbs and the response of wisdom. Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Proverbs 15:33, the fear of the Lord is instruction and wisdom, and humility comes before honor. Over and over again in the book of Proverbs, we see fear of the Lord as central to proper and skillful living. And that differs from the world today. The world might call certain actions wise, might say being shrewd in the sense of, in a worldly sense, being wise. And while Jesus certainly commends shrewdness at times in the New Testament, the way the world goes about it, often in dirty, immoral ways, is certainly something that is not in line with biblical wisdom as we look at it. So this tells us that wise living isn't primarily engaged in because it brings good results or benefits, although it generally does, but rather because it is pleasing to God. And the fear of the Lord is the preeminent principle that guides a life of submission and reverence before a pure and holy God. This is what we mean when we talk about, wisdom and what is being conveyed by the book of Proverbs. Wisdom is horizontal in nature in that it deals with practically with the way that we relate to others, but it is also vertical in nature and deals with the way in which we relate to and live before a pure and holy God. In short, wisdom reflects what God wills and desires, certainly never less than that. And it considers both the needs of others as well as our own as we live a life that is walked and lived out before our holy and sovereign God. This is the importance of wisdom. That being said, does this sound wise? This is a news story from this past Memorial Day weekend, just a few days ago. And it illustrates the need for wisdom, especially by God's people at this particular time. And this story comes, and you're probably well aware of this story. It's a story that comes from Missouri, specifically the Lake of the Ozarks, which is just outside of Branson, Missouri, in south central Missouri. I've been there. It's a beautiful place. I used to take Newell coaches up there and stage photo shoots around the lake for picturesque backgrounds to sell coaches. Now, at this particular lake, over the weekend, now Missouri is in a phase 1 lockdown at this time, large crowds in rebellion to the social distancing mandates, large crowds packed beaches, they packed lakeside resorts and bars in defiance of these guidelines. And they were crowded together, as you can see in the pictures that I'll be showing here, often less than a foot apart, often making unintended and at times intended physical contact with strangers. And almost all of them, in fact, you could say all of them virtually in the photos, were without face masks. And the mayors of Kansas City and St. Louis on Monday called out the irresponsible lakegoers and is asking for them to self-quarantine for 2 weeks out of precaution because their irresponsibility, their foolishness, their lack of wisdom poses a potential danger to others. Now, a sheriff that from a county that is involved, in fact, shares part of the Lake of the Ozarks, domain property there. His name is Tony Helms of Camden County, who's being quoted in the St. Louis Star. He noted that record crowds, and he noted that while the lack of social distancing is not a crime that they could act upon, he did say, quote, "We expect residents and visitors to exhibit personal responsibility while at the lake." In other words, he expected them to act wisely. Many of the freedoms that we enjoy in the United States are rooted and grounded and predicated upon, the responsible living of those who recognize that God exists and live before them. We have personal responsibility comes into play in the maintaining of the personal freedoms that we have and the willingness to set some of those freedoms aside for the benefit of others. Many did not. And this is what the St. Louis mayor, Lyda Crewson, responded in the St. Louis Star. Said, quote, "It's irresponsible and dangerous to engage in such high-risk behavior just to have some fun over the extended holiday weekend." I want you to think about that for a minute. This person said it's irresponsible and dangerous to engage in such high-risk behavior just to have some fun over the extended holiday weekend. And that quote makes me think, I wonder how many people on this beach back in February, March, the beginning of March, before the lockdowns, as this was just starting to crank up, I wonder how many of the people at this beach badmouthed the college students for going to Florida in order to do exactly what they themselves are now doing or did over the weekend. You see, the U.S. news was filled with stories of irresponsible college kids going to beaches and saying, "We don't care about what's going to happen to others. I'm just here to have some fun." And there was no shortage of articles in response and outrage of people saying, "Oh, these young kids, they don't care." Well, guess what? It's sad to see that it only takes 2 months of lockdown for quote-unquote older and wiser generations to follow suit. And to justify that foolishness by citing mental health and personal freedom concerns. Just anecdotally, just from our own perspective. How many people have you noticed wearing face masks and properly social distancing in our own town of Silva? I've been to Silva, I've been to Waynesville, I've been to Franklin running errands, buying supplies so we can begin to reopen the meetings of the church and things of that nature. And I can tell you from my own experiences, far less than half are engaging in that. So much so that people will look at you kind of odd because you're wearing a mask, as if you are afraid. Wearing a mask is not a sign of fear. It's a sign of concern for others. If you got it, you don't want to give it to them, and you don't want to get what they have. It's, the golden rule in action. I wonder how many of those in the pools and the beaches at the Lake of the Ozarks and on the beaches at Ocean City, Maryland, or in Daytona Beach, Florida, where other big crowds packed in and violated, had no regard for social distancing or the welfare of others, all because their freedoms were being violated, or they just, they were going to go out and they were going to enjoy because they didn't see any problems. I wonder how many of those who ignored the wisdom of social distancing would count themselves as followers of Jesus. As people who fear the Lord, which is the permeating principle of operating according to a biblical form of wisdom, probably plenty would say that. But what does their irresponsibility and thus lack of concern for themselves and others in that scenario, all that their desires might be met in a selfish manner, what does that say about the wisdom of their actions, about the validity of their claim? Because you can claim to be Jesus's all day long, but if you don't act like you care about another individual on this planet, I got to tell you, you're not Jesus's person. You don't belong to his people. You don't belong, or at least you don't live like you live in his kingdom. One North Carolina woman at a race that had 4,000 people against public rules this weekend said to a CNN reporter, quote, "We are tired of being stuck in the house. We are not afraid of this virus one bit." And let me say that this unwise attitude is common. I hear people even in the church thinking like this. But this unwise attitude is a complete fallacy. You see, one can re-engage life and others, but at this point, caution isn't fear. It's the wise response to an unprecedented situation. Social distancing and wearing a mask does not necessarily indicate fear, but it does demonstrate a concern for others as well as ourselves. And for God's people, such things are central to another bit of wisdom that Jesus commanded in the New Testament. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, granted, the golden rule and the practice of which assumes a properly trained heart submitted to the Lord. Because I got to tell you, there's probably a lot of people in the beaches, in the bars, in the pools on the Lake of the Ozarks over the weekend that was doing to others what they would like have done to them. So if you don't, a properly trained heart, fear of the Lord is essential to the operation of even this bit of wisdom that Jesus gives in the Golden Rule. And it reminds us of the critical need for God-centered wisdom at this time, and that's why we're going to be engaging in this study going forward. You see, this account and numerous others example over the holiday weekend serve as a potent reminder of the need for wisdom, but not merely common sense. You see, we need true wisdom, and that is wisdom that is expressed in proper actions before a pure and holy God, because these right actions are in line with his will and are pleasing to his will. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, as it says at various places in the book of Proverbs. The Ozark Lake example, as well as that of Daytona Beach, Ocean City, Maryland, and elsewhere, revolve around themes that are addressed in Proverbs. Does the book of Proverbs speak about selfishness? You better believe it does. A failure to consider others. Did the people in the pool fail to consider others? Did the hundreds of people overcrowding the pool area failed to consider others? Absolutely, or they wouldn't have been there. They didn't even consider themselves, other than, I want to satisfy myself like some spoiled child. That's not how God's people should operate. A failure to consider the end result of the act. That's a theme that's explored in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 through 18, we see this particular idea put out here. And it speaks about the son is warning, the father is warning the son not to fall in with violent people and do detestable things because you'll end up getting swallowed by them. And he's trying to get the son to look at the end result of the path before deciding to go down and do it. And that, in and of itself, is a form of wisdom, to determine whether the path is worthy of traveling before you take one foot down that path. And I will tell you, not one of the people who were in that pool violating social distancing rules and a phase 1 stay-at-home order did that very thing, or at least viewed it in light of what would Jesus do. Here's how this passage goes, starting in verse 10 of Proverbs 1. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive and whole. Like those who go down to the pit, we shall find all precious goods. We shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us, that we may all have one purse. He's saying, my son, if people come to you and they try to appeal to your base desires and selfishness, to entice you to do things that's counter to the will and the operation of wise operation before a pure and holy God, he says this, don't walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths. For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. They're going to suffer the very end that they're seeking to inflict upon others, maybe not in this life, but certainly in the final judgment. And the father warns the son to consider the end result of the act. And this is a theme that Proverbs deals with, and this is a theme that's necessary right now in this time, that we consider the end result of any act before we take it. How about the danger of unrestrained desires manifested in a lack of self-control? Proverbs speaks to that, and this is something that's exemplified in this example from Missouri. How about the idea of disregarding authority? Frustration at moral restraint, frustration at limitations upon behavior, resulting in rebellion. That's stuff that our children do. But that's also stuff that selfish, worldly people, also known as the fool, in the biblical book of Proverbs does. Does this sound like proper and wise living before God? Selfishness, failure to consider the way in which you walk, unrestrained desires, lack of self-control, disregarding authority and rebellion. That doesn't sound like the wise way to live before God. That doesn't sound like things that are in line with the nature of God, rooted and grounded in a fear of the Lord. And it certainly doesn't sound the way Jesus lived, nor the way that his people should behave today. And the world may chafe at safe and wise measures, but God's people shouldn't, because it reflects a concern and a love for others. John himself, the apostle of love, writes in 1 John 4:20 and 21, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. Now, obviously this is dealing with the way that some errorists were approaching the rank and file Christians in that time, but it does have application for us. Because can you say that going out and potentially exposing others and then bringing what we may have been exposed to back to our loved ones, does that show love? It doesn't even show love to self, much less to others, and then we want to worship on Sunday and say that we love God. No, you love your desires and you love your body, and you're being ruled by that rather than the Spirit of God. And that's something to think about. You see, the real problem is found in a reoccurring phrase that I noted in several articles from troubled spots in the country. And that is, in a free country, quote, you cannot legislate common sense. Well, perhaps not, for in a free country, people are free to make their own life choices no matter how dumb, flawed, or selfish that might be. But you know who can legislate the need for wisdom? Reflective of a reverence due a pure and holy God? The Father. And He does. And it is foundational to the decision-making process of kingdom living. It's foundational to who we are as Christians. And this truth serves as a reminder for us at this critical time that we must operate from a biblical wisdom. We are free in Christ and we live in a free country, but freedom must be restrained by respect for governing authorities, something that Paul spoke about in Romans, something that Jesus himself submitted to Roman authorities, even though he was being improperly charged. Individual wisdom, moral responsibility, the outward concern of how one's actions impacts others, and the lack of these things leads to anarchy, not freedom. And even in the churches, we see people willing at times to shelve wisdom in a misplaced zeal. And even some Christians serve the idol of patriotism and freedom to the detriment of Jesus' own example, which speaks of desiring mercy rather than sacrifice. There's nothing wrong with patriotism. There's nothing wrong with loving freedom. But when it becomes your God, that is the problem. Because we're never truly free. For my life is dictated and submitted to a king who puts moral restraint upon me, who commands that like he showed love and concern for others, that I too love others as I have been loved, that I forgive others as I have been forgiven, and it goes on from there. See, Jesus speaks of desiring mercy rather than sacrifice. And that's something for us to remember. And when we don't, the result can easily become a COVID cluster, like the church in Franklin, North Carolina, over the last week, not more than 15 miles from here. And while Christians should be willing to give their lives for Christ, this is not the same as obstinately and foolishly throwing that blessing away, and by doing so harming our family, our friends, and others potentially. And this is why we are studying these important themes in passages in the book of Proverbs, so that not only in this trying time, but also at all times, we remember to live wisely and properly before our pure and holy God. I'll leave you with this passage tonight from Proverbs 9 as a reminder for us. Starting in verse 9, it says, "Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. For by me your days will be multiplied, and years will be added to your life." Next week, we're going to take a look at the three primary characters in the book of Proverbs and how the book describes them: the simple, the fool, and the wise. And then we're going to begin taking a look at a topical look at the book of Proverbs and some major themes that run throughout the book as an instruction for us today. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I'd like to invite you to join us on Sunday morning at 10:30 for a lesson that is streamed with a live chat and a Lord's Supper observance, and it's streamed at woodlandcoc.online.church. We appreciate you tuning in, and you have a blessed evening.